The moment I stepped inside, the door slammed shut behind me. I hadn't touched it. My flashlight flickered, casting erratic shadows on the dusty walls. The air felt thick, like something old was breathing in sync with my every breath. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to think logically. It was just a storm outside, a bit of wind, nothing to worry about. But deep down I knew better. I knew the stories about this place. The cabin stood in the middle of nowhere, nestled between a dense cluster of pine trees. Locals warned me against coming here. They spoke in hushed voices, their eyes wide with fear, about the cabin's cursed history. They claimed that anyone who spent a night inside never returned the same or at all. I chuckled at their superstition back then. But standing here now, alone in the dark, I wasn't laughing anymore. I took a deep breath and moved further in, my shoes creaking against the worn floorboards. The cabin was small, just one room with a fireplace, an old wooden table, and a single rickety chair. Cobwebs hung like curtains from the ceiling beams, and the smell of damp wood and decay filled the air. I decided to explore, if only to distract myself from the uneasy feeling creeping up my spine. As I scanned the room, my flashlight beam landed on something peculiar, a photograph hanging crookedly on the wall. It was an old black and white picture of a family, a stern-looking man, a woman with hollow eyes, and a little girl clutching a rag doll. Their faces seemed familiar, but I couldn't place why. Then, the girl's eyes seemed to shift, her gaze moving directly towards me. I blinked, shaking my head. My flashlight flickered again, and when the beam steadied, the photograph was different. The family was still there, but the little girl was gone. Just a faded silhouette remained where she had stood. My heart thudded in my chest, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I turned away, only to hear a faint giggle, a child's laugh, coming from behind me. I spun around, flashlight darting across the room, but there was nothing, no one. The photograph, however, was now on the floor, face down. I hadn't touched it. I picked it up with a shaky hand, turned it over and nearly dropped it. The little girl was back in the picture, but her eyes were black, hollow pits, and her mouth was twisted into a wide, unnatural smile. My breath caught in my throat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice barely a whisper. No answer, just the sound of the wind howling outside and the soft, steady tick of an unseen clock. I moved to the fireplace, hoping to find something to burn for warmth. That's when I saw it, a doll, old and dirty, sitting on the hearth. It was the same rag doll the girl had held in the picture. I hesitated before reaching out, my fingers brushing against its frayed fabric. The moment I touched it, the room grew colder. I could see my breath hanging in the air. Then the whispers started, faint at first, unintelligible, like a distant conversation just beyond the walls. I held the doll tighter, and the whispers grew louder, more insistent. I could make out words now, fragments of sentences. "Leave now. Don't stay. Run." I dropped the doll, and it landed with a soft thud, its button eyes staring up at me accusingly. The whispers stopped abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence. I could hear my own heartbeat, frantic and loud in my ears. Suddenly, the clock chimed. I hadn't seen a clock, but I could hear it clearly, each chime echoing through the room, making my skin prickle. I counted the chimes, 1, 2, 3, until it reached 12, midnight, and then the lights went out completely. For a moment, there was nothing but darkness. I fumbled for my flashlight, but it refused to turn on. Panic set in. I felt my way to the table, hoping to find a candle or a match. My fingers brushed against something cold and wet. I recoiled, but before I could figure out what it was, the giggle came again, closer this time. I turned around and saw her, a small figure standing in the doorway, illuminated by a faint, unnatural glow. The little girl from the picture. Her dress was tattered, her hair matted, and her eyes, those hollow, empty eyes, stared directly at me. She held the rag doll in one hand, her head tilted to the side. "Play with me," she whispered, her voice soft but chilling. I stumbled back, my heart racing. She took a step forward, and with every step the room seemed to grow darker, colder. The shadows on the walls stretched and twisted, forming shapes that seemed almost alive. I could hear faint whispers again, surrounding me, coming from every direction. I backed up until I hit the wall, my hand searching for the door handle. The girl kept coming, her smile widening, her eyes fixed on me. "Play with me," she repeated, louder this time. I found the handle and twisted it, yanking the door open. I bolted out into the storm, the wind whipping against my face, the rain soaking me instantly. I didn't stop running until I was far from the cabin, far from that thing. When I finally looked back, the cabin was dark, its windows like empty eyes staring at me. But in the doorway I could see her, the little girl, waving her hand slowly, that same eerie smile on her face. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. As I fumbled with my keys, I heard the whisper again, carried by the wind. "Come back! Play with me!" I slammed the car door shut, started the engine, and drove away without looking back. I don't know what I encountered in that cabin, but I knew one thing for certain. I was never going back. But sometimes when I'm alone at night, I can still hear that faint, distant giggle and the ticking of a clock that isn't there.
I'd heard the rumors about this campground for years. Campers who disappeared without a trace, strange lights flickering through the trees at night, whispered stories of a fire that burned here decades ago, leaving only ashes and shadows behind. The locals called it Deadwood Camp, and they warned me against going. But I wanted to know if the stories were true, to see if I could spend just one night, 24 hours, alone in this cursed place. I arrived around noon, the sun hanging high in the clear blue sky. The campground seemed harmless enough at first. Just a patch of dense woods in a clearing where someone had built a fire pit out of old stones. A couple of broken down picnic tables sat scattered around, their wood weathered and splintered. I set up my tent close to the fire pit, telling myself there was nothing to worry about. It was just another night in the woods. I'd done this dozens of times before. But as the day wore on, I noticed the silence. It was too quiet. The kind of quiet that settles in your bones. No birds singing, no leaves rustling in the wind, just an oppressive, heavy stillness. I shrugged it off. Maybe it was just my imagination, fueled by the stories I'd heard. I spent the next few hours setting up camp and gathering wood for a fire. By late afternoon, clouds started to gather, dark and thick, blotting out the sun. A chill crept into the air, and I felt the first twinge of unease. I shrugged it off, telling myself it was just a typical weather change. But as the light dimmed, the campground seemed to change with it. The shadows grew longer, stretching across the ground like dark fingers reaching for me. I built a fire, watching as the flames crackled and danced in the growing darkness. The wind picked up, whispering through the trees, carrying with it a faint sound, like distant voices. I strained to hear, but it was just a soft, unintelligible murmur. I told myself it was nothing, just the wind playing tricks on me. As night fell, I felt the temperature drop even further. I zipped up my jacket and added more wood to the fire. That's when I saw it. A flicker of light, deep in the woods. It was faint, almost like a candle flame, bobbing up and down, moving slowly among the trees. I squinted, trying to make out what it was. The light grew brighter, closer. My heart began to pound in my chest. It wasn't a flashlight or a lantern. It was too pale, too unnatural. I stood up, watching as the light continued to approach, weaving between the trees. Then it stopped, hovering just beyond the edge of my camp. I could see a figure now, a shadowy silhouette standing perfectly still, just outside the reach of the firelight. I felt a chill run down my spine, my breath coming in short, sharp bursts. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding thin and unsure. No response. The figure remained still, the light dimming, then growing brighter again, like a pulse. "Are you lost?" I asked, my voice louder this time, trying to sound more confident than I felt. But the figure didn't move. It just stood there, watching me. The light flickered again, and for a brief moment, I thought I saw a face, a pale, distorted face, staring back at me, its eyes wide and dark. I blinked, and the figure was gone. The light vanished, plunging the forest back into darkness. I felt a wave of cold wash over me. I backed up to the fire, grabbing a thick stick, holding it out like a weapon. Minutes passed, and I began to question if I had seen anything at all. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, or my imagination playing games, but the unease wouldn't leave me. The fire crackled louder, spitting embers into the air, and I heard something, a soft crunching sound, like footsteps on dry leaves, coming from behind me. I spun around, my heart racing. Nothing, just darkness. I turned back to the fire. But something was different. My backpack, which had been by my feet, was now several feet away, lying open. I hadn't moved it. I scanned the area, my hands shaking. My breath came out in shallow gasps, and my ears strained for any sound. I could feel eyes on me, hidden in the dark. I knew I wasn't alone anymore. I heard the footsteps again, closer now, circling around my camp. Twigs snapped, leaves rustled, but no matter where I turned, I couldn't see anyone. Panic gripped me. I grabbed my flashlight and shone it wildly into the trees, but all I could see were shadows and more shadows. Then I heard a faint giggle, a child's laugh. High-pitched, distant, but unmistakable. It sent a jolt of fear through my body. I whirled around, scanning the trees with the flashlight. The laughter came again. Closer this time. I saw movement out of the corner of my eye. A small figure darting between the trees. I called out, my voice breaking, "Who's there? Show yourself." The laughter stopped, and the woods fell silent again. I moved closer to the edge of the camp, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. I saw nothing but trees and shadows, and then, just as I was about to turn back, I felt it, a cold breath on the back of my neck. I whipped around, but there was no one there. I stumbled back to the fire, my heart hammering in my chest. I needed to get a grip. I sat down, trying to calm myself. I stared into the flames, their warmth a small comfort against the growing cold around me. And then from the other side of the fire I heard a voice, a whisper, soft and clear. "Come play with us." My blood ran cold. I stood up, shining my flashlight toward the sound, and saw them, two figures standing just beyond the firelight. Two children, a boy and a girl, their faces pale and their clothes tattered and dirty. They stood hand in hand, their eyes wide and blank, their mouths stretched into unsettling smiles. "Come play with us," they repeated in unison. I backed away, my hands trembling. Who are you?" They didn't answer, just stared at me with those empty, unblinking eyes. I took another step back, my foot catching on a root. I stumbled, and when I looked up, they were gone. The fire flickered violently, almost going out, and I felt a wave of nausea wash over me. I needed to get out of here. I grabbed my pack, stuffing my things inside as quickly as I could. I tried to think clearly, to stay calm, but the air around me felt thick, suffocating. I heard whispers all around now, growing louder and more frantic. "Run! Run! Run! Run!" I turned towards the path that led back to my car, my flashlight bouncing with every step. The whispers seemed to follow, getting louder, more insistent. The shadows moved with me, shifting in the corners of my vision. I ran, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, I saw it. The light again. Bobbing up and down, moving toward me. Faster this time. I heard the laughter, the footsteps all around, but I didn't stop. I kept running, pushing through the thick underbrush, branches clawing at my skin. Finally, I broke through the trees and saw my car, parked just where I had left it. I didn't look back. I didn't dare. I jumped in, started the engine, and floored it, gravel flying as I sped away from that cursed place. As I drove, I glanced in the rearview mirror and saw them, those same two children standing at the edge of the woods, watching me leave. Their mouths open and wide, unnatural smiles. I haven't been back to Deadwood Camp since, but every now and then, when I'm alone, I hear that faint, distant laughter and feel the cold breath on the back of my neck.
I don't know why I agreed to do it. Spend 24 hours in an abandoned asylum. Maybe it was the promise of a thrill, the adrenaline rush, or just plain stupidity. The old Brookside Asylum had been shut down for over 50 years, condemned and left to rot on the edge of town. Everyone knew the stories, patients who vanished without a trace, experiments that went horribly wrong, and the screams that locals swore they could still hear at night. But I didn't believe in ghosts, at least not yet. I arrived just before noon, the sun hanging low in a grey, overcast sky. The building loomed before me, its massive stone walls cracked and crumbling, windows shattered and dark. The iron gates were rusted shut, but I managed to squeeze through a gap in the bars. The grounds were overgrown with weeds and brambles, the trees bare and twisted like gnarled fingers reaching toward the sky. I pushed open the heavy front door, the hinges squealing in protest. The smell hit me first, a mix of mold, decay, and something sour, like old sweat. I shined my flashlight into the darkness, the beam barely penetrating the thick gloom. The lobby was vast, with peeling paint and crumbling plaster. An old reception desk sat in the middle, covered in a thick layer of dust. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The air was heavy, suffocating, and the silence was almost deafening. My footsteps echoed through the empty halls as I made my way deeper into the asylum. I felt a chill creep down my spine, but I pushed it aside. It was just an old building, I told myself. Nothing to be afraid of. I passed by old, rusted gurneys and broken wheelchairs, the metal creaking softly in the still air. The walls were lined with faded posters, reminders of a time when this place had been filled with life, or something like it. I moved further in, my footsteps growing softer on the cracked linoleum floor. I reached the central stairwell, and I looked up to see floors upon floors, disappearing into darkness. I decided to start with the basement. If the stories were true, that was where the worst of it had happened. I found the stairwell leading down, the metal steps cold and slick with moisture. As I descended, the air grew colder, and a soft whispering seemed to drift through the halls, too faint to make out. I tried to ignore it, but my skin prickled with fear. The basement was pitch black, the darkness so thick it seemed to press in on me from all sides. I shone my flashlight around, revealing a long hallway lined with doors, most of them hanging open or lying on the floor. I stepped inside and moved slowly, my breath echoing loudly in the narrow corridor. Then I heard it, the sound of something dragging across the floor, a slow, deliberate scraping noise that sent a jolt of fear through me. I swung the flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just an empty hallway and shadows. The sound continued, closer now, like something heavy being pulled along the ground. "Hello," I called out, my voice shaky. "Is someone there?" Silence, and then a faint, soft whisper. "Help me." My heart leapt into my throat. The voice was weak, desperate, coming from somewhere down the hall. I took a step forward, then another, my hands trembling as I held the flashlight. The whisper grew louder, more urgent. I reached a door at the end of the hall, slightly ajar. The nameplate on the door was scratched out, unreadable. I pushed it open with a creak and shone the light inside. It was a small room, bare except for a single bed, its sheets torn and stained. And in the corner I saw a figure, a woman, huddled on the floor, her hair tangled and matted, her face hidden in her hands. I gasped and took a step back. Are you okay?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. The woman didn't respond. She just sat there, rocking back and forth, muttering softly to herself. I took a cautious step forward, shining the flashlight on her. "Do you need help?" She stopped rocking, her hands slowly lowering from her face. Her eyes, they were empty, hollow, like black pits, staring right through me. Her mouth twisted into a smile, too wide, too unnatural. "Stay with us," she whispered. A cold wind blew through the room, even though the windows were sealed shut. The door slammed behind me with a deafening bang. I spun around, my flashlight flickering, and when I turned back, she was gone. The room was empty, the bed untouched. I felt panic rising in my chest. I needed to get out of the basement. I backed out of the room and into the hallway, my heart pounding. I could hear the whispering again, louder now, more frantic, echoing off the walls. I turned and ran, my footsteps echoing in the dark. I reached the stairs and hurried up, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I emerged back into the main hall, and the air felt heavier, colder. The light from the windows was fading fast, and the shadows seemed to stretch and reach for me. I checked my watch. It was barely past 2 p.m., but it felt like hours had passed. I decided to head to the upper floors. I didn't want to stay in the dark halls any longer than I had to. I found another stairwell and began to climb, the steps creaking under my weight. The higher I went, the colder it got, my breath visible in the freezing air. I reached the second floor and stepped into a hallway, lined with patient rooms. The doors were mostly closed, some with chains hanging from the handles. I heard faint whispers again, coming from all directions now, overlapping, mixing together. I strained to hear the words, but they were too faint, too distorted. Then I heard it, a loud thud, like something heavy being thrown against a door. I turned toward the sound, my flashlight beam shaking. Another thud, closer this time, and a door at the end of the hall shuddered violently, as if something or someone was pounding on it from the other side. I moved closer, my hand gripping the flashlight tight. The door shook again, and I heard a low growl, deep and menacing. I reached out to touch the doorknob, but before I could, the door flew open with a crash, slamming into the wall. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering. The room beyond was empty, just a single chair overturned on the floor. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and I spun around. The hallway was empty, but I felt something there, something watching me. I heard a soft giggle, a child's laugh, and then a low whisper, right in my ear. "You shouldn't have come." I bolted, running down the hall, my footsteps loud and frantic. I reached the end of the hall and turned a corner, only to come face to face with a figure, a tall, gaunt man in a tattered hospital gown, his face pale and twisted, his eyes wide with madness. He reached out a hand, his fingers long and bony, his nails cracked and yellow. "Stay with us," he rasped, his voice like sandpaper against stone. I backed away, my heart racing, and turned to run, but he was there too. In front of me, blocking my path. I turned again, and there he was, over and over, appearing at every corner, every doorway, his eyes fixed on me, that twisted smile never fading. I felt trapped, the walls closing in on me, the whispers growing louder, more frantic, filling my head. I ran blindly, turning corners, climbing stairs, moving deeper into the asylum, the whispers and laughter following me. I reached the top floor and burst through a door, finding myself in a large open room. It was the old ward, where they kept the most disturbed patients. The room was filled with old, rusted beds, their springs creaking in the wind that seemed to blow from nowhere. I felt a presence behind me, and I turned slowly. The room seemed to shift and distort, the walls closing in, the shadows growing longer. I saw them then, the patients, dozens of them, their forms barely visible in the darkness, moving slowly toward me, their eyes empty, their hands reaching out. I backed up, my flashlight flickering wildly, my breath coming in short gasps. The whispers grew louder, deafening now, filling my ears, my mind, until I couldn't take it anymore. I screamed, and the lights went out completely. Darkness enveloped me, thick and heavy, and I felt hands, cold and clammy, grab me from all sides, pulling me down, down into the darkness, into the cold, into the madness. And then everything went silent. I woke up outside the asylum, the cold grey light of dawn just breaking over the horizon. My head was pounding, my body aching. I had no memory of how I got there, only fragments, flashes of faces, whispers and shadows. I stumbled to my feet, my breath visible in the chilly morning air. I looked back at the asylum, its windows dark and empty, its doors closed tight. I felt a shiver run down my spine. I don't know what happened in there, not really, but I know one thing: I'll never go back. Whatever is inside the Brookside Asylum, it doesn't want. Whatever is inside Brookside Asylum, it doesn't want to be disturbed. I staggered back to my car, my hands shaking as I fumbled for the keys. My breath was coming in ragged gasps, and I could barely keep my thoughts straight. I needed to get out of there, away from the building, away from whatever it was that I had awakened. But as I drove away, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see a face peering back at me from the back seat. There was nothing there, just the empty road stretching out behind me. But the feeling didn't go away. I kept seeing flickers of movement out of the corner of my eye, shadows darting across the fields, shapes that seemed to melt away whenever I tried to focus on them. I tried to tell myself it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but I was still coming down from the fear, that my imagination was working overtime after everything I'd been through. But deep down I knew better. I knew that whatever had been in that asylum wasn't confined to its walls. It had followed me out. When I finally got home, I rushed inside, locking the door behind me and throwing the deadbolt. I felt safer, but only slightly. I could still feel it, a cold presence, just beyond my sight. I took a deep breath and headed for the shower, hoping the hot water would wash away the fear, the grime, the cold that had seeped into my bones. But the water didn't help. I stood under the scalding stream, my skin turning red, but the chill wouldn't leave. I closed my eyes, letting the water run over my face. And that's when I heard it, a faint whisper, almost drowned out by the sound of the shower. "You can't leave." My eyes snapped open, and I spun around, but there was no one there, just the empty bathroom, steam clinging to the mirror. I stepped out of the shower, grabbing a towel, my heart hammering in my chest. I wiped the fog from the mirror, and for a split second I saw a face behind me, a pale, twisted face with wide, staring eyes. I turned around, but Again, nothing. I was alone. Or at least I thought I was. The rest of the day passed in a blur. I couldn't concentrate, couldn't think. Every sound made me jump. Every shadow made my skin crawl. I tried to distract myself, as I tried to watch TV, read a book. But nothing helped. I felt like I was being watched all the time, eyes boring into me from every corner of the room. As night fell, the feeling grew stronger. The shadows in my apartment seemed darker, deeper. The air grew colder, and I could see my breath in the dim light. The whispers began again, soft at first, barely audible, but slowly growing louder. They were all around me, coming from the walls, the floors, the ceiling. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, taunting, mocking. I tried to ignore them, but they grew louder, more insistent. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The voices were inside my head. And then I heard the footsteps, slow, deliberate, echoing through the empty rooms. I stood up, my heart racing. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice trembling. The footsteps stopped for a moment, then started again, closer this time. I grabbed a knife from the kitchen, holding it out in front of me. "I'm warning you," I yelled, but there was no response, just the sound of those footsteps moving closer and closer. The lights flickered, and I heard the soft giggle again, that child's laugh from the asylum. I felt a rush of cold air, and the lights went out completely, plunging the apartment into darkness. I backed up against the wall, my breath coming in short gasps. The whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices, overlapping, surrounding me. I felt something brush against my arm, cold and clammy, like a hand. I swung the knife wildly, but it cut through empty air. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was silence. I held my breath, listening, waiting. Then a voice whispered, right in my ear, "We're here." I screamed and the lights flickered back on. I was alone in the apartment, the knife still clutched in my hand. The whispers had stopped, and the air felt warmer, lighter. I stumbled to the door, throwing it open and rushing outside. I couldn't stay there, not another second. I ran to my car and drove, not knowing where I was going, just needing to be away, as far away as possible. I ended up at a motel on the edge of town, a dingy little place with flickering neon lights. I paid for a room and locked myself inside, feeling a little safer with four walls between me and whatever was out there. But as the night dragged on, the feeling of dread grew stronger. I kept seeing shadows moving outside the window, flickers of light, shapes darting back and forth. I tried to sleep, but every time I closed my eyes, I heard the whispering, faint and distant, but getting closer. Around 3 a.m., the TV turned on by itself, the screen filled with static. I reached for the remote, but it wasn't on the nightstand where I had left it. I got up and turned the TV off manually, my hands trembling. I turned back to the bed and froze. There on the pillow was the remote, and next to it, a small carved wooden toy, a horse, just like the one I had seen in the asylum. I felt a cold hand on my shoulder, and a voice whispered in my ear, "You can't leave." I turned, but there was no one there, just the dark, empty room. I backed up, my eyes wide with fear, and that's when I saw them, reflected in the mirror on the opposite wall. Dozens of faces, twisted and gaunt, staring at me, their mouths moving in silent whispers. I backed up against the wall, my heart hammering in my chest. The light flickered again, and the faces grew closer, their eyes wide, mouths twisted in unnatural grins. The whispering grew louder, more frantic, filling the room. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted for the door, throwing it open and running into the night. The cold air hit me like a slap, and I ran until I couldn't run anymore, until my legs gave out, and I collapsed on the side of the road. I don't know how long I lay there, shivering, crying, until I finally looked up. The sun was just starting to rise, the first light of dawn breaking over the horizon. I could still hear the whispers, faint and distant, but growing quieter, fading with the light. I made it back to my car and drove, not stopping until I was miles away from that place, from the town, from the asylum. I don't know what I saw, what I heard. I don't want to know. I just know I can't go back. I can't ever go back. Because they're still there, in the shadows, in the corners of my mind, waiting, whispering, calling me back to the asylum. And I know deep down that one day they'll find me again.
I'd always loved the countryside, the open fields, the rolling hills, the sense of freedom that came from being far away from the city. So, when I got the chance to buy an old farm for a bargain, I didn't hesitate. The property was beautiful, a sprawling 50 acres with a large weathered farmhouse and a massive aging barn, but there was something else too, an energy, a feeling I couldn't quite shake, even during my first visit. I brushed it off as nerves. After all, I was buying a place that had been abandoned for decades. Who wouldn't feel a bit uneasy? The locals had warned me, of course. They called it Raven's End, and not in a friendly way. They spoke of strange noises, flickering lights, and shadows moving in the windows at night. They talked about the previous owners, a family that had vanished without a trace in the 1950s. But I didn't believe in ghost stories. I figured it was just the ramblings of a small town trying to spook an outsider. I wasn't afraid. I moved in on a bright, sunny morning. I spent the first few hours unpacking and cleaning, wiping years of dust from the old wooden floors and the cracked glass windows. The farmhouse creaked and groaned as the wind blew through the broken shutters, but I convinced myself it was just an old building settling. By late afternoon, I decided to explore the property. The barn loomed at the far end of the field, its doors hanging slightly ajar. I felt a strange pull toward it, a curiosity I couldn't quite explain. I grabbed a flashlight. It was getting dark already, the sun dipping low behind the trees, and headed across the field. The barn was massive, much larger than I'd realized. Its roof sagged in places, and the paint was peeling off in long strips. I pushed open the door, and it creaked loudly, the sound echoing inside. The air was thick and musty, filled with the scent of old hay and rot. My flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing rusted tools hanging on the walls, broken crates, and piles of old straw. Then I saw something move, a shadow darting behind a stack of hay bales. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. "Hello?" I called out, my voice echoing through the vast space. No response, just the faint rustle of straw shifting in the darkness. I stepped inside, my shoes crunching on the dirt floor. The barn felt colder than it should have been, a damp, unnatural chill. I moved toward the back, where I had seen the shadow. As I rounded the corner, my flashlight flickered, the beam dimming for a moment. I shook it, and the light steadied. That's when I saw them. Footprints in the dust, small and distinct, leading deeper into the barn. I followed them, my breath coming in short bursts, my senses on high alert. The footprints stopped suddenly at an old wooden ladder leading up to the hayloft. I hesitated, feeling a sudden rush of cold air sweep past me. I could hear my own heart beating in my ears, louder than I'd care to admit. I pointed the flashlight up the ladder, but the light barely reached the top. The darkness up there seemed thicker, almost alive. I took a deep breath and started to climb. The wood creaked under my weight, and with every step, the air grew colder. As I reached the top, I heard a sound, a soft, shuffling noise, like someone moving across the hay-strewn floor. I shone the flashlight around, but there was no one there, just bales of hay, an old wheelbarrow, and a pile of dusty, forgotten tools. I stepped onto the loft, my foot hitting something hard. I looked down and saw a small, wooden toy. A carved horse, worn and weathered. I bent down to pick it up, and as my fingers touched the wood, I heard a giggle. A child's laugh, high-pitched and echoing through the loft. I spun around, the flashlight beam searching wildly, but I saw nothing. My pulse quickened, and I felt a drop of sweat roll down my temple despite the cold. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice breaking the silence. The giggle came again, closer this time, followed by a soft whisper. I couldn't make out the words, but the tone sent a shiver down my spine. I turned to leave, but as I did, the flashlight flickered again and went out completely. I was plunged into darkness. I felt panic rising in my chest. I fumbled with the flashlight, tapping it against my palm, but it wouldn't turn back on. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, and I could hear footsteps now, light and quick, moving around me. I could feel the presence of someone or something close by, too close. I stumbled back toward the ladder, nearly tripping over a pile of hay. My hand found the railing, and I climbed down as fast as I could, my foot slipping on the last rung. I hit the ground hard, my knees buckling under me. I scrambled to my feet and ran toward the barn doors, my heart pounding. As I reached the door, it slammed shut with a deafening crash, the sound reverberating through the walls. I yanked on it, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I heard a soft creaking sound behind me and turned around slowly. The shadows seemed to move, twisting and shifting like dark smoke. I saw a figure standing in the corner, its outline faint but unmistakable. It was small, like a child, but I couldn't see a face. Just darkness. "Why are you here?" the voice whispered, clear as day, echoing off the walls. It was the voice of a little girl, but there was something wrong with it. Something off. Something ancient and cold. I didn't mean to disturb you," I stammered, my voice barely above a whisper. The figure moved closer, and I could see it more clearly now. A little girl in a tattered dress, her hair matted and dark, her eyes wide and hollow. She stopped a few feet away from me, and I felt a blast of cold air. "You shouldn't be here," she said, her voice more urgent now, almost angry. "This is our place." I felt a pressure in my chest like something was squeezing the air out of me. I backed up against the door, my hands fumbling for the latch. The girl's eyes seemed to bore into me, and I felt an overwhelming sense of dread. Then I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from somewhere behind her. The shadows in the barn seemed to twist and writhe, and I saw another figure, much taller, emerging from the darkness. It was a man, his face pale and contorted with rage, his eyes burning with an unnatural light. "Leave now," he snarled, his voice deep and hollow, echoing through the barn. I yanked on the door again, and this time it flew open. I stumbled out, nearly falling to the ground. I ran toward the farmhouse, not daring to look back. I could hear the sound of footsteps behind me, fast and heavy, but I didn't stop. I reached the house and slammed the door behind me, locking it tight. I stood there, panting, trying to catch my breath. I glanced out the window, but the barn was still, dark, and silent. No movement, no figures, nothing. But I knew what I had seen. I knew what I had heard. The farm wasn't empty. It never had been. It belonged to them, and they wanted it back. I didn't sleep that night. I packed my bags at first light and left, never looking back. The farm is still there, waiting. And sometimes, when the wind is just right, you can hear the faint sound of a child's laughter, carried on the breeze, calling you back to Raven's End.
I had to see it for myself. The old church at the edge of town. Everyone talked about it like it was cursed, a place so soaked in evil that no one dared step foot inside. But I had always been curious, stubborn, and a little reckless. That's why, when I found myself with a free weekend, I decided to spend a night inside the church, 24 hours, alone. I parked my car a good distance away just in case the local sheriff happened by. He'd warned me, just like everyone else, not to go near the place. But I was determined. The church stood alone on a small hill, its silhouette sharp against the dying light of the late afternoon. It was an old stone building, its wooden doors weathered and warped. The tall windows were stained with years of grime, their colors dulled by time. The steeple, once majestic, was crumbling, with bits of slate scattered around like teeth from a giant mouth. I reached for the heavy rusted door handle and gave it a hard pull. The door opened with a groan that seemed to echo forever. I stepped inside, and the smell of old wood, dust, and something else, something foul, hit me immediately. I felt an instant chill, even though it was warm outside. The door closed behind me with a dull thud, and I was plunged into dimness. I took a few steps forward, my eyes adjusting to the darkness. The pews were lined up neatly, but they were covered in dust and cobwebs, untouched for what looked like decades. I saw broken hymnals scattered across the floor, their pages torn and yellowed. The altar stood at the far end, draped in a stained, once white cloth. A large crucifix hung on the wall above it, tilted slightly to one side. Its eyes seemed to watch me. The stained glass windows, even covered in grime, cast strange, muted colors on the floor. Reds, greens, blues, all distorted and wrong. My flashlight flickered slightly, and I tapped it against my palm. "Great," I muttered. Then I heard it, a faint rustling sound coming from the left side of the church, near the old confessionals. I turned the flashlight toward the sound, my heart pounding harder than I'd care to admit. The light fell on a confessional booth, its curtains swaying slightly, as if someone had just brushed past it. I forced myself to breathe, to stay calm. "Wind," I whispered to myself. "Just the wind." But the air was still, heavy, too heavy. I approached the confessional slowly. The door creaked open on its own as I neared, revealing nothing but darkness inside. I felt a cold draft sweep over me, and a voice, a low, raspy whisper, filled the air. "Forgive me." I jumped back, my breath catching in my throat. The whisper repeated, a bit louder this time. "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned." I could see no one, only the black void inside the booth. I shook my head, taking a step back. "It's just your mind playing tricks on you," I muttered. I turned away, deciding to explore the rest of the church instead. I walked down the center aisle, feeling the eyes of 100 stone angels watching from the crumbling walls. Then came the sound of footsteps, soft, shuffling footsteps coming from the back of the church. I turned around, my flashlight beam sweeping the room, but there was no one there. The steps continued, closer now. I backed up, moving toward the altar, trying to keep my breathing steady. I heard a low, mournful moan, like the wind pushing through a narrow space, but there was no wind. The moan grew louder, filling the room with a deep, resonant vibration. The crucifix on the wall above the altar began to sway, its chains creaking. Suddenly the church bells tolled, 3 deep, resonating chimes. My head snapped up to the bell tower. There was no one there, but I could see the bell moving, swinging back and forth as if an unseen hand had set it in motion. The sound was deafening, crashing through the silence. My flashlight flickered and went out. I cursed, fumbling for my lighter, my fingers trembling. The darkness closed in, thick and suffocating. I could feel it pressing against me, as if something was lurking just beyond the edges of my vision, watching, waiting. I struck the lighter, and a small, flickering flame appeared. I held it up, and that's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, standing in the pews, staring at me. Their faces were pale, their eyes hollow and black. I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. The figures did not move. They simply stood there, watching me. Their mouths moved, silently at first, then louder, whispering words I couldn't understand. I felt a cold sweat break out on my skin, and the temperature dropped even further. Then, one by one, they began to step forward, their footsteps echoing against the stone floor. I could see them clearly now, old, young, men, women, dressed in clothing from different eras, their expressions blank, lifeless. But their eyes seemed filled with rage, with torment. I backed up until I hit the altar. I could hear the whispers growing louder, more frantic. "Get out," they seemed to hiss. "Leave this place. Leave this place." The crucifix above me creaked again and began to twist on its chain, spinning slowly as if caught in some invisible wind. The whispers grew to a cacophony of voices, each one louder than the next, a wave of sound crashing against my skull. I covered my ears, dropping my lighter. The flame extinguished, and I was plunged back into darkness. I fumbled for the flashlight, praying it would turn back on. When it did, I wished it hadn't. The figures were right in front of me now, their faces inches from mine. Their mouths were open, stretching wider than humanly possible. their eyes wide and unblinking. A scream caught in my throat. The bell tolled again, and the figures began to chant, their voices deep and distorted. I felt a cold hand brush against my face, and I jerked away, panic clawing at my insides. I had to get out. I turned and ran toward the door, my feet slipping on the cold stone. I could feel the figures following, their footsteps like a drumbeat in my ears. The whispers continued, merging into one voice, one single, terrifying voice. "You are not welcome." I reached the door and pulled, but it wouldn't budge. I yanked harder, the wood groaning under my weight. I felt hands on my shoulders, cold and firm, pulling me back. I screamed and threw myself against the door. Finally it gave way, and I stumbled outside into the night. The air was cold and fresh, the wind howling through the trees. I turned back to the church and saw the figures standing in the doorway, staring at me with those hollow eyes. The door slammed shut with a force that shook the ground. The church bells tolled once more, a final ominous note that seemed to hang in the air. I ran to my car, my heart racing, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't look back, not until I was miles away. Even now, as I sit in the safety of my home, I can still hear the faint sound of the church bells in the distance. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I feel those cold hands brushing against my skin, hear the whisper of that voice telling me, I am not welcome. I never should have gone to Pendle Hill that night. My friends dared me to spend a few hours at the witch's grave, said they'd give me £100 if I could last until midnight. I laughed it off at first. I don't believe in ghosts or witches, but money's money, and a dare's a dare. So I went. The wind howled as I climbed the hill, the air thick with mist. I found the grave easily enough, a jagged stone, crooked and weathered, its inscription almost completely faded. I could barely make out the name, but I knew this was the place. My phone's flashlight barely pierced the dark, and every shadow seemed to stretch, reach out, crawl closer. I checked the time. 11:43 p.m. Just 17 minutes to go. I tried to calm my nerves, telling myself the stories were just that, stories. The witch was dead and buried, bones long rotted, nothing more than a pile of dust beneath the ground. But the air grew colder, and a soft whisper seemed to rise from the wind, a voice I couldn't quite make out. I felt a prickle on the back of my neck. I spun around, but there was nothing, only the darkness and the shapes of the trees swaying like twisted figures. The wind grew louder, howling in my ears like laughter, and that whisper, closer now, almost at my ear, "Leave." I froze. The voice was clear now, raspy, ancient, a low growl that made my blood run cold. I turned in every direction, but I was alone, wasn't I? I stumbled back, and my foot hit the grave marker. A shock ran through me, cold as ice. I looked down, and my breath caught in my throat. The ground was moving, no, crawling. Thin, pale hands clawed their way up through the dirt, fingers long and bony, nails black and cracked. My heart pounded in my chest. I tried to move, but my legs were frozen, paralyzed with fear. I watched as a figure began to rise from the grave, a woman, gaunt and pale, eyes sunken, hair wild and tangled. She opened her mouth, and that whisper came again, louder, echoing around me. "Leave, before it's too late." I turned and ran, stumbling down the hill, not caring where I went as long as it was away from there. The whisper chased me, growing louder, more desperate. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I kept running until the whisper faded into the wind. When I finally dared to look back, Pendle Hill was silent, still. I could barely make out the grave in the distance, just a shadow in the mist. I never did get my £100, but I left something of mine up there, a piece of my soul, still shivering on that dark, lonely hill. And sometimes, in the dead of night, I swear I still hear that whisper, calling me back.
When I inherited my grandmother's old house, I expected dust, decay, and maybe a few mementos. I didn't expect the clock. I found it tucked away in the attic, a massive grandfather clock with dark, ornate wood and a cracked glass face. The hands were frozen at 3:15, and I could have sworn it gave off a strange hum, a low vibration that I felt more than heard. At first, I dismissed it, just an old house settling, I told myself. But then, every night, at exactly 3:15 a.m., the air seemed to thicken, and the temperature would plummet. And the ticking. God, the ticking. It would start slow, barely noticeable, but it grew louder each night, echoing through the halls. One night, curiosity, or maybe something else, got the better of me. I grabbed a flashlight and headed to the attic, each step up the creaky stairs amplifying that relentless ticking. When I reached the top, the sound was deafening, the clock's hands twitching violently in place. I stepped closer, drawn to it, and reached out to touch the cracked glass. The moment my fingers brushed it, the hands started spinning backward with an almost frantic speed. A freezing gust swept through the attic, and the clock struck 3:15 with a chime that seemed to rattle my bones. Pain exploded in my head, a sharp, blinding ache that knocked me to my knees. Through the haze, I saw them, shadows swirling around me, whispering louder and louder. I could make out their faces, some familiar, some strangers, all of them twisted with fear. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized I recognized a few of them, family members, long dead. The clock chimed again, and the shadows moved closer. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. I felt myself being pulled, dragged toward the clock, my feet scraping against the floor. I caught a glimpse of my reflection in the cracked glass, a face I barely recognized, mouth open in a silent scream, eyes wide with terror. The hands of the clock reached 3:15 one last time, and everything went dark. I don't know how long it's been. But if you find yourself in the attic, if you hear the ticking, get out. Because if the clock reaches 3:15, you might be next.